Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud while stoned. In this video, we're going to start part 2 of Little Blue Book number 1141, titled The Reformation and the Protestant Reaction. By Joseph McCabe. Copyright 1920. This one actually has a copyright date in it. 1926. And Joseph McCabe was a bit of an expert on the Catholic Church. He was a Catholic priest for 11 or 12 years, and then excommunicated, left of his own free will, and became an atheist. But he was a scholar of the Catholic Church, so he knows his history, so to speak. But, alright, here we go. This is part 2. Oops. And, there we go. When you have made a league with one man, the Pope used to say, there is no reason why you should cease to negotiate with his opponent. Accordingly, he signed a secret treaty with Spain against France, and, at the same time, a secret treaty with France against Spain, and a few months later secretly entered the German League against France. His aid, it is important to remember, always took the form of the funds which the papacy wrung out of Europe. He made secret terms with the French king, then decided both him and his other allies, then both deceived him and his other allies, and tried to escape by revealing their secrets to each other. Later, he again sold his secret support to France for $500,000. Do you think these guys would quit buying his... Anyhow. For $500,000. That's crazy. And within a fortnight, secretly signed a treaty against France with Spain. This unparalleled duplicity, as the Catholic historian Pastor calls it, was merely the last stage of papal interference before the crash, and every monarch in Europe was profoundly disgusted. The first blast of the great storm was already raging in Germany, and the chair of Peter was occupied by a fat, lazy, and utterly unscrupulous sensualist. I wonder if that's a nice word for pervert. A man who was said in clerical circles to have boasted that his luxurious life was based upon the world's belief in the fable of Jesus Christ. At this point also, just when Luther had taken the warpath in Germany, the fiscal system of Rome reached its most scandalous proportions. Rome had so many sources of income that it is impossible even to summarize them here. Peter's pence, the direct contribution of the faithful to the Pope, may be dismissed as comparatively respectable. The Papal States yielded a further income, which might be deemed respectable if the Pope's title deeds were not errant forgeries. As we all now admit, and if the maintenance of them through the ages had not meant so much bloodshed and intrigue. Beyond that, one may admit that, like the civil service, the papal curia had a right to recoup its clerical and administrative expenses from petitioners. But this innocent plea of payment for necessary servants had grown into a colossal and sordid system of extortion, entailing the grossest simony or sale of sacred things. The charges for dispensations from various disabilities alone brought a huge sum and were scandalous. For instance, the degrees of kindred which formed an impediment to marriage without a dispensation were extended further and farther until one could not marry a person related within 4 degrees by blood or marriage or spiritual relationship. These and other impediments were deliberately fabricated in order to make money out of the dispensations. When some pious Christian expostulated with the vice-chancellor of Pope Innocent III, the system was already fully developed into the 13th century. He cynically answered, God desired not the death of sinners, but that they should pay and live. The result was that the poor, who were related to practically everybody in their village and never got away from it, lived in sin and scoffed at the rich. There was no divorce, but a large payment so sharpened the eyes of the papal lawyers that they could discover a flaw in and declare null and void any marriage of a wealthy man. The most holy sacrament of marriage, says a Catholic writer, was made a subject of derision to the laity by the venality with which marriages were made and unmade to fill the pouches of the episcopal offices. Sorry about that. I had to pause because my drink was out of reach and the cottonmouth was advancing quickly. Okay, here we go. This, remember, is only a single class of dispensations. There were many others, such as dispensations from erroneous penances. The real quarrel of Rome with the Spanish Inquisition was about money. But even today, in Spain, you can buy a dispensation from nearly all the fast days of the church during a year for 10 cents. Boy, that's probably not 10 cents anymore. It's 1926 costs for dispensations, apparently. But the two corrupt sources of revenue, which were most significant in connection with the Reformation, which exasperated the clergy as well as the laity, were the sale of benefices and the sale of indulgences. John the 22nd, one of the Avignon popes, a miserly lawyer who organized the papal finances, made a drastic beginning of what is quite probably called the sale of benefices. An earlier pope had declared that the benefices of priests who died at Rome passed to the disposal of the papacy. John made this a general law of the church. When a benefice, the salaried position of a priest, chaplain, abbot, bishop, etc. So that's called a benefice. And I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, so I don't care. Fell vacant, the successor of the dead incumbent was to pay 3 years' revenue to Rome. Wow. Benefices, or bishoprics, etc., were multiplied by the papacy, and candidates for the vacant office came with their offers of payment of first fruits, just as they made offers for any other lucrative appointment. The infamous John the 23rd extended the system and gave it a quite sordid character. The papacy had spies and an information bureau reporting on the health of ailing or aged priests. Wow. The expectation of the benefice was sold to the highest bidder. And even after this, a preference would be sold to a second man over the head of the first. The most disgusting traffic in sacred offices continued throughout Christendom for 2 or 3 centuries. But again, it will suffice to take an instance from the reign of Leo X in the days of Luther. It will probably occur someday to an historian or medical man to inquire whether Leo X was entirely sane. There was in his time such a demand for reform, such an open scorn of the church's corruption, that Leo had to hold a council in Rome to consider it. He, of course, thwarted the council. What idea of reform could there be in a man who spent largely the personal luxury about $2 million a year? That's in like the 1300s. $2 million a year. And surrounded himself with a court of buffoons and immoral companions. He needed vast sums of money, and he used the corrupt system of the Vatican more unscrupulously than any before. Oh, 1500. In 1514, in order to have the political support of the Elector, Albert of Brandenburg, he permitted that young and licentious noble to assume the dignity of Archbishop of Mainz. And against all church rules, he further permitted him, for a bribe of $100,000, to retain the bishops of Magdeburg and Halberstadt. Germany was particularly angry about the corrupt system, and Germany was treated by the papacy as if it were a nation of helpless peasants. Albert of Brandenburg was told that he could recoup himself out of the sale of indulgences. And this brings us to the second most corrupt source of income. I will not linger over the word sale. You can, in Spain today, get valuable indulgences sealed and signed by the Archbishop of Toledo, who says that he has a fresh papal authorization every year in a shop. You pay 75 centrinos, about 15 cents. Centrimos. That sum is marked on the paper. And if you offer $0.25, you get your chance just as if you had bought a cake of soap. The church says that your money is a gift or alms to itself, and that the indulgence is a gift to you. It is the emptiest of bunk. Indulgences indulgences are sold in Spain today, and were in the 14th and 15th centuries sold all over Europe. I thought he said he wasn't going to use that word, sold. What did he say up there? Never mind. Oh, cottonmouth. Creeps in on you. The indulgence started as an arrangement by which man who was condemned to an erroneous penance for his sins might have it commuted for an alms to the church. In time, the popes discovered that the wonderful graces and indulgences you gained by making a pilgrimage to Rome might be gained just as well by paying to the church the price of such a pilgrimage. From that time, the 14th century, indulgences were given for money payments everywhere. The price of a pilgrimage to Rome was high, so the scale of the alms was lowered. The church, as ever, was mindful of her poorer members. In other words, she realized that 1,000,000 gifts of a dime each are worth more than 100 gifts of $20 each. Boy, the church is smart, aren't they? Most people are now aware that an indulgence does not mean permission to commit sin, or even absolution from sin. It means that a certain amount of punishment in purgatory is wiped off the slate. Pope John the 23rd, the Council of Constance actually sold absolution from sin, but that is exceptional. Still, any person who knows Catholic sentiments will understand that the indulgence encourages sin by making it easy to avoid the punishment, purgatory, which the Catholic dreads most. Confession relieves him of the fear of hell at any time, but not the penalty of purgatory. The traffic reached its culmination under the popes of the Renaissance, and especially Leo X. For the maintenance of the luxury of the court and for the building of St. Peter's and other monuments, colossal sums were needed. Leo X organized the sale of indulgences as if they were a new cure for indigestion. Commissionaries were sent everywhere and flaunted the papal banner. They cried their wares like street salesmen. And again, it was Germany, the most disaffected part of the Christendom, that was most exploited. The cup was full. Rulers, priests, and people were talking angry or scornfully of this system, which was somehow imposed upon them as part of their religion. Pamphleteers had a resounding success. Boy, that's a really good title. That'd be nice to be a pamphleteer. That's a job we lost. Someone should bring that back. Had a resounding success. And at last came the man who could prove that this was no part of Christ's religion, and that therefore Rome had apostatized from Christ. You think. Okay, that's the end of chapter 2. And we're going to pick up chapter 3. It's titled Martin Luther. First, I'm going to get rid of this cottonmouth again. It really just creeps in. Okay. Chapter 3 of the Reformation and Protestant Reaction. Martin Luther, the man who got it all started. German scholars have devoted very considerable research to the condition of their country in the half-century before Luther raised the flag of revolt. And it is now known that the land was particularly ripe for insurgents against the papacy. With their customary blindness to actualities, the popes did not appreciate the changes which were taking place in Europe, and proud of the strength and wealth they had recovered since their return from Avignon, they contemptuously ignored all protests except where their political or diplomatic interests were involved. Thus, France had been induced to withdraw its support from the conciliar movements in 1438, and had been granted a liberal arrangement with the papacy in the pragmatic sanction of Bourges. England and Spain had come to terms at an earlier date. In Italy, where Marsiglio of Padua had published a virulent attack on the papacy as early as 1324, was, as usual, cowed into submission. The German emperor had ostensibly got a favorable concordant with the papacy in 1448, but it left the principal sources of friction unsettled, and there were loud and constant complaints of papal greed. The excuse was now made that to increase the extortion, large funds were needed for a campaign against the Turks. Yet, Christendom presently learned with horror that Popes Innocent the Eighth and Alexander the Sixth accepted $100,000 a year from the Sultan to keep his younger brother a captive at the Vatican. What do you know? And that Alexander the Sixth offered to prevent a war against the Sultan if the money was paid. Complaints were formulated at every meeting of the German diets, and it was particularly emphasized that the fine folk at the Vatican treated the Germans as slaves, barbarians, and beer swillers. Boy, Germans loved their beer forever, haven't they? And contemptuously refused to hear them. For a time, there was a renewed demand for a general council, but Pius II decreed that such an appeal was an infringement of papal rights, and the Germans had to be content with venting their anger. No wonder Germans are always pissed. The new circumstances, which escaped the notice of the popes, were the rapid growth of the feeling of nationality of Germany, the kindling of some spirit amongst the peasantry themselves after the abolition of serfdom, the dissemination of the ideas of the humanist, and eventually the invention of printing. Very extensive agitations amongst the peasants already existed in the 15th century, and peasant orators who had immense influence were not slow to point out how the people were exploited by the clergy. By the middle of the century, there were scores of printing presses in Germany, and, scanty as education was, the new invention was in controversy, something like what the invention of gunpowder was to warfare. There was, in the second half of the 15th century, a sort of religious revival in Germany, purification and deepening of religious sentiment, which tended to concentrate attention on the words and spirit of Christ. Editions of the Bible poured from the press, and 1,000 could now consult the actual words of Christ, for one who could have done so 50 years earlier. Luther seems to have exaggerated from imperfect recollection when he said in later years that he was almost the only monk of his body to read the Bible. In the 70 years before the revolt of Luther, about 200 editions, total or partial, of the Bible were printed in European languages, and 18 of these were in German, and there were some 500 or 600 editions in Latin. Another formidable weapon provided by the German press was the literature of the humanist. Erasmus, as we saw, quieted his native Netherlands, where Spain and the Inquisition ruled, and ultimately settled in Germany. Is that quieted or quitted? I think he quitted his native Netherlands. Reuchlin, an older and more orthodox humanist, had to some extent prepared the way for him, but the brilliant and dissipated young poet Erlich von Hutten, 1488 to 1523, hit the popular taste even more effectively with a broad passage in the Colleagues? Yeah, that's what we're calling it, of Erasmus. Ex-monk himself, he had ample material for controversy, and his courage was equal to his wit. He printed in Germany Lorenz of Vala's Exposure of the Fraudulent Bases of the Pope's Temporal Power, the donation of Constantine. And in conjunction with another German writer, he issued a work, The Letters of Obscure Men, in which he held up the ridicule the Orthodox monks who defended the papacy by assigning to them letters and combined orthodoxy and stupidity in equal proportions. The anger of Germany thus assumed at times the more dangerous form of laughter. Scores of pamphlets circulated deriding the papacy and the clergy. Pause for hydration. At the height of this movement, Leo X, as I said, gave Germany a most cynical proof of his contempt for their claims. Men already murmured that the archbishopric of Mayence had been vacant 7 times in one generation, and that the price which the papacy demanded for appointments to it was raised from 10,000 to 25,000 gulden. Then Leo sold it to the quite unworthy elector Albert of Brandenburg, who merely desired its revenues, and in addition permitted him, for a large consideration, to keep 2 other episcopal sees. Albert was, as we saw, to recover part of his payment by a share in the proceedings of the sale of indulgences. And it is here that the Dominican monk Tetzel and the Augustan monk Martin Luther enter the story. Few characters in history have been so vehemently libeled and so unscrupulously glorified as Martin Luther. To the uncultivated Protestant, he is, after Jesus and Paul, the third founder of pure Christianity, a man purified and ennobled by the spiritual flame that burned in him and removed from him every human defilement. To the Catholic, he is an instrument of the devil, a coarse and fierce sensualist, a man whose very breath was foul with obscenities, a fool who, for the turning of the page, come on now, who, for the tickling of his vanity, who doesn't like a good vanity tickle every now and again, who, for the tickling of his vanity and the gratifications of his passions, perjured his soul and fabricated a charge against the church. Yet no character that has thus been painted by rival love and hatred in fantastically exaggerated colors is more easy to appreciate. Catholic literature, even in our own day, 1926, when it affects an air of liberality, is stupid in its exaggerations. Professor McKinnon, Professor McKinnon, quotes a work by German Catholic, which I have not been able to see, and tells us that it contains a crushing expose of the Catholic Baron von Britchingen's Luther and the Reformation, but a good idea of the stupid tradition may be obtained from the American work, The Facts About Luther, by the Reverend Major Dr. P. O'Hare. From such a very reverend and learned-looking author of the Catholic, expects the very truth, and is assured by a professor of the Catholic University of Washington, the Reverend Professor Dr. Gilday, who writes the preface, that he gets it. The book is a quite sordid piece of deceit. The Reverend Professor first tickles the appetite of the reader by announcing scenes of coarseness, vulgarity, obscenity, and degrading immorality. That is Catholic university culture in America. Even the writer on Luther in the Catholic Encyclopedia ignores this libel and his authorities, and instead of immorality speaks only of unsurpassable and irreproducible coarseness. But Father O'Hare reproduces this for us. He opens his book with the constructive lie that learned and distinguished historians like Jansen, Denifile, and Grisar, Grisar, and many others have painted with masterly accuracy the real picture of the Reformer. He conceals from his Catholic readers the fact that Denifile and Grisar are just church-serving priests like himself, and that the many others have a profound contempt for their lies about Luther. Then he discovers that even unscrupulous hatred can invent no calumny about Luther as a student, monk, and professor. So he fills his book with dreary discussions of doctrine and untruthful defense of the faith. We saw, for instance, that the last straw laid upon the back of Germany was Leo X's cynical deal with Albert of Brandenburg. Albert's purchase of the archbishopric is actually defended. His character is not mentioned, and not a word is said about the Pope permitting him for a corrupt bribe to retain two of the bishops. However, in the last chapter we reach the obscenities promised us by the introducing professors. Luther's immorality, the priest assures us, is vouched for by numbers of witnesses, and the only one he quotes is a bitter Catholic opponent of the Reformer who makes a vague general charge. On the strength of this and some of the passages in which Luther sterilizes clerical celibacy and bluntly tells monks and nuns to go and get married, we get the quite childish assurance that to defy indecency No. To deify indecency. Yeah. Was part of Luther's satanic desire and diabolical purpose. Wow, they really lay it on thick. This sort of melodramatic mouthing is what the American Catholic reads as a summary of learned and... I wonder if it's changed. Probably not. There we go. And learned distinguished historians, from refined Father Grisier and refined Father O'Hare, even reproduces the very delicate suggestion that Luther had syphilis. Wow, that's rude. One almost regrets that the kind of blunt and forceful language which he quotes from Luther has gone out of fashion, and that one has now, more politely, to describe this kind of literature as the dung of obese Jesuits and the dollar-catching drivel of lick-spittle servants of the Pope. Ooh, just cut it loose. Mic drop. There is no dispute about the fact that Luther was a profoundly religious man. That is to say, a man of not only the firmest belief in Christianity, but of exceptionally strong religious sentiment. In his table talk, and that's in italics, he describes adultery as a crime most odious. A crime at once against God, against society, and against one's family. And, as against Dr. O'Hare's repeated statement that he glorified sexual intercourse and ridiculed the idea that a man or woman could remain virginal, we have his advice in insisting on purity to the preacher of the gospel. Is he able, with a good conscience, to remain unmarried? Let him so remain. Luther was a man of strong sensuality. His temperament was peculiar in this, that he united an acute nervous sensibility and explosiveness with the eupeptic blood circulation that usually goes with placid nerves. Man, words we don't use anymore. He therefore felt acutely the conflict of his flesh and the contempt of his creed for the flesh. But he was too sincere in his faith to assuage the conflict by a compromise between the two, or by devoting a Saturday to the one and a Sunday to the other. It is impossible to say exactly why he became a monk, but I agree with Professor McKinnon that an explanation given by himself in later years is the correct one. That in a dangerous thunderstorm, he vowed to enter a monastery if his life was spared. Boy, don't you hate when that happens. Make one of them stupid promises and then, fuck, now you gotta do it. Okay, here we go. The Augustinian monastery he entered was not lax, and the fierce conflict of flesh and faith tormented his early manhood. In spite of his admitted austerities, he brooded morbidly for years on what Paul calls in the Latin Bible the justice of God. It suggested a Ramadanithus of a judge, particularly in regard to the innocent physiological movements which the Christian calls bad thoughts. How could a man like himself, with so many bad thoughts, hope to escape his searching and fiercely punishing judge? And it is admitted by all that this terrible stress ended long before he had any idea of a breach with Rome, in a discovery that there was a mistranslation of the Greek text of Paul. He had spoken of God's righteousness, not justice, and a perfect confidence in God would infallibly bring whatever grace was necessary for salvation. These things do not of themselves interest us today. Even the normal Protestant or Catholic does not now go home after glimpses of the upper regions of silk stockings on the screen, or of bare limbs in a review or a vaudeville, to tear the sheets and wet the pillows with tears. But Luther's struggle and the solution of it, while he was still a monk, are part of the essential history of the Reformation. Turning the page. These pages are all falling apart. I've got a little pile of little page chips on my desk just from this reading session. Sometimes it can be very difficult to turn the page. Okay. It was evolving. It was evolving in Luther's mind to inevitably as events were moving toward it in the world at large. But without those outward events, we should never have heard of Martin Luther. He had no instinct of rebellion. In 1510, he visited Rome on business of his Augustinian order, and after seeing all the corruption, he went back meekly to his cell. He was He was not of heroic stuff, son of a miner. He had in early manhood a great sympathy for the oppressed poor, and spoke scornfully of their lords and exploiters. But when the peasants rebelled and appealed for his aid, he, not unmindful that if princes deserted the Reformation, it was certainly ruined, harshly exhorted the masters to treat them as mad dogs and shoot them. The career of such a man naturally has weaknesses, but the only one worth serious notice is his fiery temper and coarseness of language. He was, as I said, of an explosive, nervous temperament, and to say that he often, in the trying circumstances of his struggle, flew into a rage is merely to say that he was not a saint. The coarseness of his language at times, his table talk, generally reads as sportively. Boy, I don't know, that one's got me kind of stumped. As Marcus Aurelius, cannot be lightly set aside as explained by the lowness of his home or the general coarseness of his Middle Ages. Though, if we had the same extensive and intimate knowledge of some, even of the bishops and nobles of the time, we might find them using the same language. Luther, indeed, might have argued, if any person had objected to his fluent scattering of asses and swine that Jesus himself was pretty free with, explanatives like blood of vipers and so on. In short, Luther was not and never professed to be a meek saint or an anemic apostle of gentleness. He did not see that Christianity obliged him to say women of ill fame with a blush instead of whore. For any serious historical purpose, his coarseness is as immaterial as the size of his boots. We know about that. And I think that's where we'll stop. Yep, that's where we'll stop. We got 38 minutes into this one. That's long enough time to listen to my voice for an extended period of time. So, that's where we'll stop part 2 of Little Blue Book, number 1141, titled The Reformation and the Protestant Reaction, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1926. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 3.